Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everyone, I'm Nick, and I'm excited you're listening to the Family Ministry Podcast. This is episode 27, and in this episode, I interviewed Tom Shefchunas. A lot of people know him as Coach Chef. He's the multi-campus middle school director for North Point Ministries in Atlanta, Georgia. Tom and I talk about the coach role, the volunteer coach role, like what does it look like to have volunteers who lead other volunteer leaders, and how can that help your ministry? We talk about what it looked like for them at North Point, how they got into it. In fact, it took them a few tries, which I think is probably encouraging for the rest of us because it's not an easy thing to do. But they kept working at it and got that role in place. And we also talk about metrics, measurement, assessment, like how do you gauge the health of your ministry? What's important to measure? And, is it possible to measure too many things? And so it's a great conversation with Tom. He knows those things really well and does a great job with that. And so I'm excited for you to hear from him. Before we jump into the interview, I would love it if you would be willing to leave a review and a rating on iTunes. You can do that. Just jump into iTunes. If you're listening through iTunes, go in there and leave a rating and review. Talk about this podcast, how it's been helpful to you. Maybe it's your first time listening. Who knows? But that would be great because it helps get it out in front of other leaders. All the notes that you'll hear, things that we'll talk about in this episode, you can find in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 27. Let's go ahead and jump into my interview with Tom. Today, I'm joined by Tom Shefchunas. Tom, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Tom, so tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your role at North Point.
Yeah. So my name's Tom Shefchunas. Been working with students now for almost 20 years, first as a public educator, then a private school educator, and then a high school principal, believe it or not. And then about 11 years ago, came on staff here at North Point. Along the way, I married my wife, Julie, 19 years ago. We have 3 kids, 13. So they're in my ministry now. So that's fun.
Different. Yeah.
Yeah. 11. Well, she'll be 11 next week, and 7. So we're busy. I'm the multi-campus director of middle school for North Point Ministries. So I don't have a home or place. I work here in the corporate offices, supporting our local teams at each of the 6 campuses here in Atlanta, as well as provide content for our partnerships, churches. And there's a growing amount of those across the country, and actually in different countries now. So that's fun. And
if for anybody that doesn't know, I think I will be able to describe this correctly, but you can correct me if I don't. But the campuses you're all one church, one staff, budget, the whole thing, located in different places. Whereas partners are they're aligned with you strategically, mission, vision, values, but they're their own church. It's kind of like church plants, correct?
Yes, they're their own. The only thing I'd correct you is on the campus side, and this isn't a whole nother podcast, but and I don't know anybody else that does it this way. We're not one church with many locations. We're 6 Atlanta churches with the same mission and vision. And for right now, we have Andy Stanley, so most of the time communicator. But they're free to not play Andy on any given Sunday, as the folks who run transit are free not to use the multi-campus content that we create. So my job's a little bit tricky. I'm more of a coach who has to leverage the fact that the environment that I create for everybody to come together is super effective, and that people want to be a part of it. And so that's a little bit, I know it sounds like it's the same thing, but it's
different. Yeah, it's definitely, and I kind of knew that, but because you probably do have separate budgets too.
We do. They're separate budgets, although we all put into the same, thing. There's churches who, for lack of a better term, make money that goes towards churches who are newer churches who are a little bit behind as they're catching up. And then we're all funding, hopefully, new churches as we move forward. So
that's cool. It is a unique model. I mean, I guess what's attractive about it is if you do lead at one of the campuses, you are tasked more with leadership in the sense that you can have some more flexibility. You can do some things the way as opposed to here's the play, run it.
Yeah. I mean, we believe deeply in the local church, and that's the hope of the world, and that a local church needs to be run by local people. And and not just feel like it's run by local people, but actually be run by local people. So we're trying to bridge that gap. Sometimes the natural pull is for it to be mothership model, because that's just more efficient. And sometimes you just want to throw your hands up and say, let's just do that. You have to do that, but it's really better in the long run, though it's a lot more difficult, a lot more expensive, the person in charge of transit is a young leader who's really in charge of transit, and we're hopefully developing leaders for the future as we go. So, yeah,
that's cool. So do you find yourself going to campuses though, regularly and see it work as you're developing stuff and resourcing them? You're showing up, right, and seeing what that looks like, but you're just not tied to one.
I'm not tied to one, and each campus knows that they can use. There's 5 of us here on the multi-campus team. They can use us really as contractors, free contractors. So, if they ask me to come speak this Sunday, I'm going to one of our new campuses and doing a luncheon where I'm training new small group leaders. It's kind of my thing. I love that. And so I do a lot of leader training. I do a lot of speaking on Sunday. Sometimes they just need me to come and host and be a goofball. I mean, my least favorite Sundays as the multi-campus director is when I'm driving to a campus just to observe.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Those are tough Sundays for me.
You want to be involved.
Right. And, I'm not going to observe anything that doesn't bother, the leaders on the ground more than it bothers me. So that's a tough part of my job. But the good news is I don't do that a lot. I'm also, when we do camps, I'm usually at the camp and we're helping put on camp for the campuses over the different weekends as they show up. So this year we had 4 separate boot camps, which is our 6th grade camp. So they would show up at different weekends, and we had 5 different frequencies, which is our camps for our 7th and 8th graders. So I'm pretty busy in the fall with camps.
Sounds like most student ministry leaders. Do you guys combine for those camps, like multiple campuses come to the same one, or is it 4 and 5 because you're doing one per church?
If we can fit them, like North Point, for instance, right now, the main campus, we can't get the 7th and 8th graders to fit in the camp. So we have to divide them, and then we'll take a smaller campus and put them with them. A lot of times what we found is we can open up more space or fill the camps more effectively. And so now this year it's kind of going by different grades. And so it might be, this weekend is the Brownsbridge 8th graders with the Buckhead 7th graders, and just because that's where the numbers worked out that we could fill as many beds as possible.
Yep.
So that's kind of how that's been working this year. We found a larger camp. So next year we're going to try to run camps simultaneously on different weekends. And it's going to allow us fewer weekends in a row of work, although we'll be doing more work on each weekend. But
that's cool.
The kids won't know. They'll experience, the same camp and, or different camps. But it's one reason that doing like our 6th grade camp, we do the same camp every year for different kids, which really allows us to refine the camp every year as opposed to having to start from scratch every year creatively.
Yep.
And so the beauty is the volunteers who come, year after year to help us put on the camp, they know where everything goes. They know the basic structure of camp, and it really streamlines the whole process. So anyway, again, another podcast.
I know I could talk about that forever, but that's not why I originally asked you to come on, because
that's right.
We've been to a couple environments with Orange or some different things Orange puts on where you've talked about 2 topics that I think are really helpful, not even just to student ministry leaders. I think it's helpful to children's ministry leaders as well. And this podcast is for both. So this will be great. One of them is the idea of the volunteer role of a coach, like somebody whose volunteer responsibility is not to lead a small group of kids or students, but to lead a group of small group leaders and help them and serve them and all that stuff. So what does that role look like at North Point in middle school ministry?
Well, it's a good question, and it varies a little bit by campus. But in general, this is a position we felt the need for years and years ago. We have a position called groups director in our strategy, and a groups director is a staff member who's in charge of small group leaders. And what we found is a woman's groups director can handle about 65 to 75, maybe 80 ladies from the small group side of things. And a guys groups director can handle more like 80 to 100. The women take more time. They do crazy things like return emails and answer questions and have questions. And guys just, you
That's
don't
awesome.
have seen it till they show up on Sunday. So they tend to be a little bit less work during the week, a little more unprepared on Sunday. But
that's a balance, I'm sure.
Yeah. So that's the ratio. But if you think about it, that is that's a tough amount of people to really pastor and know their heart. So we're with them for 3 years as they sign up for a 3-year commitment with us. And so we really felt the need to put a level of leadership between the groups director and the small group leader. And so we tried twice and failed and finally got it right on the third time, I think. The first time, I think it was really almost like a management thing. This person was to help make sure the small group leader shows up, make sure that there's coverage. They're the prime communication point. And it was much more just make sure the attendance is taken, those sorts of jobs. And that's not a job that feels real important. And so we were tapping, experienced small group leaders on the shoulder to do that. And they just weren't inspired by it. And so they would it just didn't work. So then I wrote up a job description that was a little more specific. And we felt like we needed experienced small group leaders to talk through, the troubles of leading small group in middle school and, give someone a voice. And so we found our best small group leaders and put them in place as coaches. And that didn't work. And I think the reason that didn't work was, Barry Bonds might be a terrible hitting coach because Barry Bonds has the gift of hitting,
Yeah, that's why a lot of former players are coaches, but it's the ones you never heard of. And
right. Yeah, that's right. Because they're the ones who struggled and worked hard and had, I was a good math teacher when I was in education because I wasn't a great math student. And so if it's just natural to you, you're just like, well, just do it, just hit the ball. And so that didn't really work well at all. And we were taking some of the best salesmen off the floor to be managers, and that doesn't make a lot of sense either. So we finally got to it, and I think to something that worked. And basically what we identified was mentor-level adults who are probably older. And for me, the qualification with the male group leaders, as I was in charge of finding them at the time, was would I want to go to lunch with this guy and ask him about being a better father, a better husband, talk about my sanctification and what I'm working on? Is this the sort of person who's going to move me forward? And so we started to identify those types of people. Some of them have no experience leading small groups. But what we found is they're wise, so they usually can answer the question. Usually they're older and many times have had kids. So they can talk from, the experience of parents and just be super wise. But what we found is a lot of the communication, a lot of the discussions coming from small group leaders had it was like 10 to 20% small group issues and 80 to 90% personal life issues. And so the way I describe it now is when someone signs up to be a small group leader with us, they've basically joined the gym and we're going to give them a trainer for free. And it's this mentor level person that's going to get into your business and help you grow while you're leading students through all this, if that makes sense. So that became an inspiring job. And that became the sort of job that our mentor level people wanted because it's really a pastoring job. So we have CEOs and CFOs and, stay-at-home moms, but just real wise mentor level people who are inspired to be like, yeah, I would love to be a pastor, and so they step in and they do that. And so they get, 8 to 10 to 12 adults that they walk with for those 3 years that they're really in charge of mentoring and walking alongside and supporting them while they're leaders of our small groups.
That's good. So, now, do they still have to do anything that I would put under the category of like they have to help in the environment? Or is it all? Oh, they do. So they do show up and there's some roles that they have.
They do show up every Sunday. I really treat them like unpaid. I treat them like staff. So they need to make sure there's coverage. They're the person the small group leader calls if they're not going to be there. They often will sit in different small groups, which is a really cool thing. The best coaches I have, the kids all know who they are because they're always around. And so We have 2 adult small group leaders per group. So say, there's 2 separate weddings and there's no small group leader. The last thing I want to do is mix groups because that kind of blows up the intimacy of group. Well, the coach that's been around and they all recognize steps in a lot of times, and they love it. It's kind of like getting to be a grandparent small group leader. Grandparents love that they get to go hang out with the babies, but then someone else takes care of them when
they just go home and they're done. Yeah.
So a lot of times it's, a good small group leader who's been through it a few times and really is just ready for something new for a season. And so they step in and be the small group leader of small group leaders. So that's how it works. We don't advertise for the position. So when we're looking for volunteers, we don't mention it. This is an invitation only type job. And so, we do our best to find the best of the best. And, sometimes they're old small group leaders. Sometimes they're just our mentors, which at some point we just say, hey, would you, volunteer on Sunday? Some of them, are staff members that don't have a Sunday assignment. And some of them, a couple of them, I know last year we were having an interview with an older woman to be a small group leader and found out that she's a professional coach and that she, and just in talking to her about her skill set, our director, Jen, she just said, hey, let me tell you about another job that we don't advertise. Would you be interested in that? And she's been a great ad. So she had to come in. It was a little bit different. She had to come in and learn, some of the big ideas of transit and our strategy, but she's smart. That wasn't tough. And she, was in love with it. So there she goes. She's off and running as one of our coaches.
That's awesome. Do they have to provide any type of training in that sense? Like obviously the ones who were small group leaders before, even if they're not great coaches, at least have more familiarity with that. But
right.
So do they do that, or is it kind of like you help provide that? They're really just pastoring almost. Like
we'll give them a copy of Lead Small so they understand the group strategy and what we're looking for in a small group leader. And then it's really on the job training. When they go to camps really, they come to camp with us and they are staff. And so they get to see the behind the scenes. They get to hear the strategy. They get to understand that we have a work crew that runs ahead of the small group, setting up the events. So the small group leaders don't do camp with us. They actually go to camp with their kids and experience all of the excitement and fun as we're creating memories for them. And then they're really the people, like at the end of the night, when we send people out to say goodnight, we send the coaches out. And I'm like, hey, I want you to go, especially boot camp, new 6th grade leaders. I want you to go make eye contact with every one of your leaders, make sure they're okay, bring them a bottle of water, and see how it's going. So, it's really trial by fire.
Yeah,
pretty quick.
I imagine you have a camp early on too, and so that one's really trial by fire.
It's right there at the beginning. So it's we identify the small group leaders who maybe shouldn't have made the cut, and the coaches that maybe didn't make the cut, or did make the cut and shouldn't have. But the other thing we do is a yearly retreat, and that's the coach's opportunity where we really try to honor them, spoil them, and give them an opportunity to speak into our ministry and our strategy. And so it's the right type of person is really honored and takes that very seriously. So it's like, hey, here's our strategy. What do you think worked? What do you think didn't? And we just let them speak into our ministry, and they come up with some amazing ideas. I mean, it's like, I can think of one of ours is the CFO of a publicly traded large corporation, and the way he sees the world is in the organization of a ministry, or just an organization of an organization. He's got a unique view, and he has added so much value to it and sees transit in a different way than we do. We'd be crazy not to lean into that. But the beauty of it in God's economy is he's being honored while we're being blessed with his knowledge, and it's a really cool time.
The other thing too is he may never have volunteered somewhere if the only options were small group leader, or teacher. You know what I mean? Is that,
right.
Sometimes you get people in these roles who are like him, and they wouldn't love doing any other role that you have. So that's pretty cool.
Right. We find these guys in the parking teams and stuff. They want to work with the church, but they also, they're looking for something to do, and so they can kind of check a box. But when you go and cast vision for being a coach, and don't try to make it easy. Make it seem like a challenge. Make it seem like this is not for everybody. This is going to be really hard. I know it's really a sacrifice, but what do you think?
Yeah, that's awesome.
The right person is inspired by that.
Yeah. That's good. Is the coach retreat, by the way, is it just a coach retreat, or is it all leader retreat and they're there? Or was it just for them?
It's coaches and the staff, and we'll go out and get a couple of cabins. Guys will play golf. The ladies will do, whatever they do. It just depends on which campus they work at. They do some different things. And then we go in, we have a nice dinner together. Usually the staff cooks for them. We'll get some grills and get some decent food. And then, they will go into the evening, like late at night, and just talking about how to make the ministry better and dreaming about its future, and
yeah.
And then talking about real life situations that we walk through over, sharing their best practices. But it's really just it's a fun event. And we get so much out of it, and so do they.
When do you do it? Like, I'm sure you pick a good time that where they can reflect on part of the year, but.
So, we normally do it right there at the end of the summer before the ministry season starts. But, it's another thing to do in one of the most busy times of the year. But
yeah.
But we've got some new coaches that need to get on the same page with their new leaders. So that's when we try to do it.
That's good. So if a lot of people listening, they don't even have this role yet, like you added it, obviously, and had to try a few times. And the tension, I know this is true all over, but I know it's even more true in children's ministry world. The tension is I've got 8 holes to fill with leaders, not coaches. So do I try to fill those roles first? Do I, or do I get the coach and get them to help me? How have you seen that work out, and what would you recommend people do there?
Well, first of all, you will never have enough leaders. That tension's never going to go away. And in fact, when we made our decision to move from 1 small group leader per group to 2, we didn't have enough for 1, but it was what we needed to do. And so we just had to, put our nose to the grindstone, and our battle cry is more leaders, better leaders, I think that's part of it. I wouldn't necessarily pick, say, okay, I need 6 coaches. Who are those 6 people? I don't think that's the way to go about it. I think you ask, who are my stars? Who are my mentor level volunteers? And if you have 3 and you need 6, then you start with those 3 and you move forward, because the reality is you've been operating without them, right?
Yep.
And
anything else?
The wrong person can give you more work.
That's a good point.
The right person will really help you and support you, and will free you up to do what only you can do as a staff member or as the person charged with the ministry. I know we have lots of people who are in charge of the ministry and they're not on staff. So, but just find those right people and start to gather them slowly, and put the right ones in place. Pass on others. If you're not sure, then don't ask. They don't know. They're being turned down for a job that they don't even know exists. So, I would be sure about somebody before I asked. And if they turn you down, then, that's the last thing you want to talk somebody into. Because you'll find yourself making exceptions. Just the right people are inspired by a really hard challenge, and they can connect their gifts to it, And so I'd start there. I would structure, sit down on a piece of paper and say, okay, ideally, if I were doing this, based on the size of your ministry, how many small groups would I have? How many small group leaders would I need? How many coaches would I need? I would think, 90% of youth ministries in the country could get away with a great male coach and a great female coach. And that would be, because they can handle, those type of people can handle 10 to 15 people very well. But over that, you need to start talking about, okay, I need 2 guys, or 2 ladies, depending on how many small group leaders you have in the structure of your ministry. So
that's good. That's good. Well, we want to shift gears a little bit and talk about metrics and measuring and, what you all measure. And I know a lot of people, this is a hard thing to talk about, because either they don't like the idea of measuring anything with church. There's just like this, fight against numbers and stuff like that. Or some people just don't even, they care about it, but numbers, data, analysis, it's like boring. Why do you think this matters? Why do you think this matters? Why it's important? Because I think my perspective of North Point is you don't obsess over a lot of numbers. You don't measure a whole lot. You find what you really care about. So tell us about that. Why do you think, why does it matter to you, and why should it matter to everyone?
Well, I think you need to look at measurements, and you need to think about what they need, or what they mean. So, I've heard people say you can't lie with statistics, or statistics don't lie, but you can lie with statistics, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
You've got to be smarter than the numbers, and numbers matter. I think for most people, the alpha and omega of statistics is attendance and offering.
Sure.
That's kind of what they're watching,
especially pastors.
Yeah,
but they're important. I don't want to say they're not important, but yeah,
right. And you're being judged on your effectiveness based by, is the attendance growing or shrinking? Across the board from the beginning, we felt like attendance on Sundays neat, but people in circles is more important. So we set a numeric goal years and years ago of people in group. We wanted people in community. And so that's the only numeric goal we've ever set. And we set it a really big, crazy goal 10 years ago that we haven't reached yet. But we look at it every month, and we're getting closer and closer and closer. So that's fun. I think attendance we do watch, but you don't watch necessarily every Sunday. I look at Sundays compared to last year, for instance.
Yeah.
This same Sunday last year. Oh, it rained last year on this day. Well, rain or a time change, or those are all going to affect. It was the Sunday during a school break. Those are all going to affect your numbers. So you just have to be smarter than the numbers. But really, what you're looking for is the trends. Are we attracting more people over time? How many visitors we had on a Sunday, I think, is a great metric that I think that's something to be worried about. Are people feeling comfortable to be here? But maybe a more important number is how many of those visitors stayed over time. And one statistic I'm concerned about right now is if you look at the number of visitors we have every Sunday and you compare it to the number of people in group over the years, the number of visitors is not visitors, but people who've signed up for group. The number of new enrollees is higher than our growth in groups, which means we're losing kids somewhere.
Yeah, you're losing existing kids, or they're not sticking.
Right. So, where is it? Well, of course, people move away and all those sorts of things, but that doesn't explain it away. So there are kids missing. There are kids who are getting connected and then falling off. So where are they? My hunch is, looking at the numbers as we're digging into this, is it's really within the first 90 days of being here that they either get connected to a person or not, and
sure. It's like school. They're going to make friends. Yeah.
So that's an example of where the statistics have, I think, pointed us in the right direction to work on something that's lacking in our ministry, which is that first timer experience and how they're being connected into group. So we've got different campuses trying some different things, and we're focusing on that for this season, and we're learning a ton.
That's cool. What else do you measure, to gauge the health of middle school ministry specifically, but obviously this would apply to a lot of ministries?
Goals for baptisms, because that starts to feel a little bit disingenuous. But if we're baptizing less kids every year, we need to think about what's going on, So we watch how many kids we're baptizing. Again, you've got to be smarter than the numbers and know that, depending on how many baptism Sundays you have and everything else, those are all, different ways of thinking through it. We watch the number of Double Dog Dare kids that are coming on, which is our kind of outsider event every year. We want to see that increase. But really the main statistic we really kind of focus on is the idea of active role. And this is the number of kids who are engaged in our ministry or active in our ministry. So active role, I'll get super practical with you on this. Active role is the number of kids in our ministry or have been in the last 14 months. And so on the fourth Monday of every month, we will go through and bring up a list and see who hasn't been here in 14 months, and we will deactivate them. We won't purge them. We won't eliminate them, but we will deactivate them.
14 months or 14 weeks?
I'm sorry, 14 weeks.
Yeah, 14 months is a long time.
14 weeks. So even that date is really interesting. I'm glad you brought it up, because when we first did it, we thought it was like 8 weeks. And what we found is we were reactivating so many kids every week that we were within, the kids can disappear for good reasons in the middle of it. You've got kids in your ministry that are on different attendance. I think on average they come half the time, but the reality is if you look at it specifically, you've got a 10 to 15% block who's here all the time, which are probably when you close your eyes and see your kids, those are the kids you see. But the reality is the biggest chunk of your kids come about 50% of the time. And that's because, people often come 50% of the time, especially if they have kids.
Yep.
But the next biggest chunk, to our surprise when we dug into it, was kids that came 5 times a year or less.
Yeah.
And they are active within our church. They like to come. The reality is they don't drive, so they're connected to a family. They often come to our events. They would say they're part of transit, and they're just at a different place in their spiritual growth where they're at the beginning of their spiritual growth, and they have a parent who just doesn't love to come to church, or is just getting into coming to church, or they live in a home which is over half of our kids that have experienced divorce. They're at their dad's every other week, or they get to come to their dad's 10 times a year and he brings them to church, So these are all the different, but these kids would say they're part of transit, and we want our small group leaders worried about not just the kids who show up on Sunday, but, maybe even more the kids who aren't, and to reach out to them during the week and to be, just to let them know we miss them, that we'd love to see them come back. So active role has been a game changer for us when it comes to how we talk about the small groups, especially the small group leaders. We talk about not the kids who are there on Sunday, but the kids who are on your roll. And that's changed. But we also, if you think about it, you can also judge how effective a small group is simply by looking at, okay, there's 20 kids in that group, and this small group over here sees about 6 of them a week, and this small group over here sees about 16 of them a week.
Yeah.
Well, that leads to a really good question, about what's going on in the different groups. And we may very well find out this group just has an abnormally high of divorced kids, and this is just how this works. Or we may find out this small group leader is not doing a lot of contact outside of the Sunday. So the idea of active role helps us. It also gives us a name for every kid. So it's not just attendance doesn't give you names. You don't know who is there, right?
Sure.
But active role allows you to think about who is there and what groups are doing well. It also has moved into, we now set our goals for camp. We now set our budgets for camp based on the ratio of active role of kids that show up. And so you can think strategically about that sort of stuff. So when we move into boot camp is our 6th grade camp. The main idea of it is that we're going to introduce kids to their small group leaders and their small group, and we really want it to be a catalyst right at the beginning of their middle school experience for community, and we want them to be close relationally as we talk to them about the 3 vital relationships a Christian has, and a ton. We can talk about the curriculum again, another podcast of that. But the goal for the group is to really jumpstart community. Well, if you think about that strategically, then we need at least half the kids to show up for that to happen. And so when we're setting our budgets, we can say, okay, how many kids are coming up from 5th grade on active role? And where do we expect the active role to be about the time they get to 6th grade? And we need to set a budget for at least half. In fact, we now set our budget for 60% of the active role. 60%. No, that's not true. 70% of the active role of 6th grade. No, I'm sorry. 60% is for boot camp. 70% for our Disciple Now weekend we call Walking Wisely. And 50% for frequency for our 7th and 8th graders is kind of our role. And we've exceeded those to the point where we might need to adjust our roles. What we've seen is we had almost 80% of our kids on active role come to 6th grade camp. Well over 80% of our kids come to Walking Wisely. And then probably closer to 60 to 65% come to the frequency camp. So, we're talking about changing our quote goals to reflect that, but that just allows us to plan for the future and see who's coming based on the active role of the grades that are moving into our ministry and plan accordingly.
That's good. And it's definitely a better way to look at things, right? Because I know our fall retreat's kind of like the kickoff of the fall, and we look at last year and year over year, and we used to compare it to average attendance, and recently it passed average attendance, which was great. And that's something to celebrate. But when you look at the active roll, our active roll, I don't know about yours, but ours is basically 50% larger than attendance, So if there's 100 students, our active roll is 150. So now all of a sudden it's like, okay, well, we're kind of like near where you are. We're getting about 2/3, and that's good, but there's more, Well,
attendance can be, especially if you're in a church, that has, you can have 30 kids come to you in 6th grade, and the average class is usually 20. And all of a sudden your ministry looks like you're blowing up. But the reality is, you just have more kids that were passed to you. Yeah. Or the opposite can happen and you're being judged because the ministry is shrinking. And you're like, actually, I'm being more effective with the kids, who have come. And we're actually growing at a faster rate than we've ever grown. But the numbers have gone down because it's a smaller class. So in a church our size, it's pretty consistent. But when you start to break it down by campus, they can be fluctuating by 100 or 200 kids, and that you can be looking at your attendance numbers, wondering what the heck's going on. But if you look at it, you're actually doing better, than last year compared to if you're looking at the ratios to active roll. So
we do that too. We paid close attention. We just did this because we are in the fall to how many 5th graders are coming up. And I know, for instance, like our high school grew tremendously this year, and it's because we put in 2 huge 8th grade to 9th grade groups. And for us, that made a big difference in the numbers, but in reality, did it really grow? It's not like we were reaching new students, the attendance is just higher and all that kind of stuff. Cause if you graduate, I don't know, let's say you graduate 20 students, but you add 40 in 6th grade, that alone, should grow. That's great. And hopefully we're also reaching students some other ways too, which is really cool. Do you use active roll in any other specific ways? I'm trying to think of like how we can help leaders do it. Obviously, the first thing is define what your cutoff is. Yours is 14 weeks, which I do like because I guess that also captures students who are gone over summer or they're gone because they play a sport for a whole season and they're just gone. Yeah. Right. So that's good.
Yeah. I think that probably, that might be different in high school. For us, it works pretty well. The way we, actually using it in budgeting, if you think about it, our jobs, or even our job descriptions, our jobs don't fluctuate with attendance, right? Our jobs.
Yeah, you do it for 100 or 150. It's the same work.
You're still doing the same program. Yeah. And if you have attendance of, 800 this week and 1,200 the next week, we still have the same amount of small group leaders to take care of. They're just going to go, there's just going to be more kids in each room. I still have the same number of small group rooms to get ready. So active roll is really what drives the metrics when it comes to budgeting. So I tried and failed last year to get because all of our budget numbers are based on attendance because that's how it traditionally has been. And you can look at, staffing's based on attendance. Yeah. Our staff model is based on attendance. But as I said, our jobs don't change based on attendance. Now, the reality is attendance is reflective of your active role. And if you can figure out that ratio, you can tweak the math, which is what I did get. I did end up getting the staffing model changed based on the mathematics I presented because of active role. I explained that. But the reality was, you have to be very, you just have to be on it to maintain an active role, an accurate active role. And if a ministry doesn't take that seriously, then you're starting to make decisions based on numbers that aren't accurate. But attendance is an easy number to be accurate on. You can double check those. Yep. Yeah. And attendance is reflective of active role. So the mathematics gets there.
So it can help you. But you guys, your system is, it's, your cutoff, it's 14 weeks. You said monthly. You're running the search on that. So you're taking kids off the roll if they haven't been there 14 weeks. You can always add them back on.
Yeah. And one of the systems I'm trying to figure out is I challenge my staff with this is there any way that we can move to a policy that we don't ever deactivate a student without someone knowing the reason?
Yeah, that would be good. That'd be really
Wouldn't that be good? Because that would force, and we're working on it, it would force the conversation to go back down from the coordinator who's deactivating to the groups director who's in charge of the coach, to the coach who's in charge of the small group leader, and then calling them up and going, hey, we're about to deactivate, Toby. Do you know where Toby went? And, it might be, oh my gosh, I need to give Toby a call, Yeah. And, or it might be, oh yeah, Toby moved. Well, then we know at least where the kids are going and why, which I think leads you to make better ministry decisions,
Yeah.
about your programming and your small group leaders and everything else. So that's the system that hopefully moves us to the who in all of it.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before. Statistics should be all about who. Like they should lead you to a who. You shouldn't just be measuring things just to measure things. It should be all about how do we serve people better, right?
The rhyme is don't let statistics bother you that don't lead you to a who. So
yeah, that's good.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Yeah, and that's why all of this is important. I know, some people are wired to. I like the analysis and all this stuff and statistics. Some don't, but this is where they matter because you've already given a few examples just in our conversation about how some of these metrics led you to find something that you didn't know about.
Sure. And when you read an article about, 14% of, I can't remember what it is, 14% of the kids are cutting no, that's not the right statistic. I was doing a bunch of them at an orange tour. I can't remember them off the top of my head.
Yeah, I remember we went to the orange tour and saw that.
Well, the statistic I used at the orange conference was 1 in 5 adults will report that in their first 18 years, they experienced some sort of sexual abuse. Now, that ranges everywhere from, horrific sexual abuse to a manipulative relationship when you're 16 and 17 years old with an older, partner. But it's realistic. But when you read that statistic, you need to think about your active role and say, I've got 100 kids on active role, which means 20 of my kids have experienced, or will experience, and you've got to wonder who, right?
Yeah.
And ask yourself the questions: do I have a safe enough environment where a kid could come to us? Because if they're not going to come to the church, who are they going to go to?
Yeah. Do
I have safe enough small group leaders that are going to put in the time that a kid will finally get to the place to say, hey, can I tell you something?
Yeah.
So any statistic you ever read like that, you should always put the filter of your active role over top of it and go, I wonder who it is.
Yeah.
Which will make your ministry better, help you make better ministry decisions, and make you a better pastor in the moment. So,
well, that's awesome. This was great. This is really, really helpful. If somebody wanted to connect or reach out or follow you on social media, how could they do that?
Yeah, I'm just Coach Shef with an S, Coach SHEF. On Twitter and Instagram. Not a great Instagrammer, but someday I might be. If you want to follow
You're working
me.
towards it. Yeah.
I'm working through it, and I'm trying to, I've got that, and then that's the best way really to get a hold of me or figure out where CoachShef.com is going to be. It's in the middle of being updated, but it will just have my contact information and then probably information about some of the coaching I do and where I'll be next. So I'll be at the Orange Tour events if you want to connect that way, the Orange Conference, and just doing some family things with churches around the country. So I can show up there a couple of days. Was just in Kansas City, connected with a great church out there, sat down for coffee and talked through a lot of this stuff. So just if you see me going somewhere, reach out and maybe we can talk.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, thanks again for taking this time. This has been really, really helpful.
You bet. Thanks for having me.
It's difficult to think about, but what we talked about there at the end could be true. We may have kids and students who are dealing with difficult things in our ministry, and we don't even know about it. And if we just pay attention to the statistics and think about that as it relates to our ministry and the number of kids and students we have, it's likely some of those things are present. And we should do something about it. We should figure out how can we help students open up about something they're facing that they're not talking about with anyone. What are some action steps we can take to help them do that? As we talked about the coach role in this episode, something you might want to do is add that role to your ministry if you don't currently have it. You could start by writing up a job description. What does that look like? What do you want from someone who serves in that role? And then I think a great step would be to pick one person to invite to serve in that role. You may draw it up and think, I need 5 coaches or I need 20 coaches. And you probably do. But I think it's important to start with one. Who can you start with? Who's one person you can start with who can serve in that role and help you get it in place and start to model it, and that would help it grow. In terms of the metrics and measurement and all that, in student ministry, I think a great action step would be to figure out your active role. So what's your benchmark? Is it 12 weeks, if you've been once in 12 weeks or 16 weeks or whatever it is, and then figure out what size your active role is and use that to evaluate some other things. How well are you caring for them? How well are they serving, going on trips, and different things that you want students to do? Use active role as a way to measure the health of those things. Another action step would be to put a system in place to follow up with kids and students who've stopped attending. This is pretty popular in the student ministry world because attendance can be even more sporadic there. But we're seeing that, like most churches, in children's ministry too. And so I think it's important to have some kind of system in place that if you don't see a kid or student attend in a specified length of time, there should be some way that we follow up and we check in and we see how they're doing. I think that's really important. You can get these and all the other show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 27. If you haven't subscribed yet, you'll want to do that because in the next episode, I interview Anthony Prince. Anthony's a next-gen pastor, but he also works with Ministry Architects, an organization that helps churches with their children's ministry, student ministry, and now they're working with churches overall. And they really got their start with student ministry, but they have something that I've not seen in many other places. From their work with churches, they talk about what are important and healthy staff ratios, like how many full-time equivalent staff should you have for every so many kids or so many students? What are important volunteer ratios? What are important budget benchmarks? So how much total budget should be going to children's ministry and student ministry? I see these questions come up all the time. People are wanting to know what's normal. How much staff should we have? How many volunteers is needed to lead the ministry well? How much should we spend on these ministries? And so you don't want to miss that episode. We'll also announce something that's going to be helpful in terms of figuring out where your church is compared to other churches. That'll be helpful to you too. So be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.